I'm sitting in my Honda Civic outside the most beautiful wedding venue in Charlotte, North Carolina, clutching a manila folder that contains documents my family never expected me to find. My heart is racing as I stare at the elegant stone facade of Rosewood Gardens Event Center, where my brother's rehearsal dinner is happening right now. The same rehearsal dinner I was explicitly told not to attend. The same venue that, according to the contract in my lap, I've been paying for all along. My name is Jessica Chen. I'm 29 years old, and I'm about to walk into what might be the most satisfying moment of my life, or the most devastating. Honestly, at this point, I'm not sure there's a difference. The irony isn't lost on me. That I'm sitting outside in my 6-year-old car, while inside, my family is celebrating a wedding that cost more than most people's annual salary. A wedding funded entirely by money that was supposed to be mine. Money from my grandmother's inheritance that mysteriously disappeared into what my parents called family investments after she passed away 2 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The folder beside me contains bank statements, legal documents, and email exchanges that paint a picture so shocking I'm still processing it myself. My best friend Rachel Martinez, who's currently hiding in the passenger seat trying to look invisible, spent 3 weeks helping me uncover the truth about where my inheritance went. What we discovered wasn't just financial betrayal. It was a systematic campaign to erase me from my own family while using my money to fund their celebrations. I never thought I'd be the type of person to stage a dramatic confrontation, but here I am, wearing my best black dress and the pearl earrings my grandmother left me, preparing to walk into a room full of people who've spent years making me feel like I don't belong. The difference is, tonight I have proof that I belong more than any of them realize. Let me take you back to how this all started, because the story of tonight begins with a phone call that changed everything. But first, you need to understand who I am and how I ended up being treated like the family disappointment when I should have been treated like the person keeping their lifestyle afloat. Growing up as Jessica Chen in the suburbs of Charlotte wasn't supposed to be complicated. My parents, David and Margaret Chen, immigrated from Taiwan in the early 80s and built what seemed like the perfect American dream. Dad worked his way up to regional manager at a logistics company, while Mom became a respected pediatric nurse at Carolina's Medical Center. They bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the upscale Myers Park neighborhood, complete with a manicured lawn and the kind of front porch that screams, "Successful immigrant family." My younger brother Timothy was born when I was 3, and from the moment he could walk, it was clear he was going to be the golden child. Where I was creative and free-spirited, Tim was methodical and ambitious. Where I asked too many questions and colored outside the lines, Tim followed directions perfectly and excelled at everything he touched. By the time we were in elementary school, the dynamic was set in stone. Tim was the future doctor or lawyer, and I was the artistic one who would probably figure things out eventually. The problem with being the artistic one in a family that values traditional success is that creativity doesn't translate to report cards the way academic achievement does. I struggled with standardized tests, found traditional classroom learning stifling, and was far more interested in spending hours drawing or designing than memorizing formulas or historical dates. My parents saw this as a lack of focus rather than a different type of intelligence, and their disappointment was a constant presence in our house. Tim, meanwhile, seemed to effortlessly excel at everything. Straight A's, captain of the debate, team, early admission to Duke University with a partial scholarship, and later a fast-track MBA program that led to a lucrative position at a financial consulting firm. He dated the same girl, Catherine Walsh, all through college, and their relationship was as perfect and planned as everything else about Tim's life. Catherine came from old Charlotte money, the kind of family that owned historic properties downtown and had streets named after their ancestors. While Tim was accumulating achievements, I was trying to find my place in a world that seemed designed for people like him. High school was rough. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't excelling either. And in a house where excellence was the baseline expectation, mediocrity felt like failure. My parents enrolled me in tutoring programs, summer academic camps, and even considered holding me back a year to give me time to mature academically. The message was clear. There was something wrong with me that needed to be fixed. The breaking point came during my senior year when I announced that I wanted to take a gap year before college to intern at a graphic design firm downtown. The explosion that followed was legendary in our household. Mom cried, Dad lectured me about wasting opportunities, and Tim looked at me with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for much more serious transgressions. Jessica, you can't just opt out of your education because school is hard, my mother said through tears. This is America. Education is how we succeed here. It's how we honor the sacrifices your father and I made. Dad was more direct. You're throwing away your future because you want to draw pictures for a living. This is not what we worked for. The gap year became 2 years. The internship led to freelance work, which led to my own clients, which eventually became Chen Creative Design, my one-person graphic design business. But instead of celebrating my entrepreneurial spirit, my family treated my success like a happy accident that couldn't possibly last. Every family dinner included comments about when I was going to get a real job or go back to school for something more stable. Tim, meanwhile, was becoming everything my parents had dreamed of. His career was skyrocketing, his relationship with Catherine was serious, and he was talking about buying a house and settling down in Charlotte. When he announced their engagement 3 years ago, the celebration lasted for weeks. Engagement party, couples shower, bachelor and bachelorette parties, and now this wedding that's been in planning for over a year. Throughout all of Tim's milestones, I was increasingly relegated to the sidelines. Not intentionally excluded exactly, but not really included either. I was the +1 at family events, the afterthought when plans were made, the sister who was loved but not particularly respected or valued. It was death by 1,000 small cuts, each one individually insignificant but collectively devastating. The pattern became more obvious when Tim and Catherine started wedding planning. Suddenly, every conversation in our family revolved around venue visits, dress shopping, and guest list management. Catherine's mother, Patricia Walsh, became a frequent presence at family dinners, and her old money sensibilities seemed to influence how our family events were organized. The engagement party was held at the country club. The couple's shower was a sophisticated affair with personalized favors and a professional photographer. Everything was elegant, expensive, and somehow I was always slightly outside the inner circle of planning. I told myself it was because I was busy with work, or because wedding planning wasn't really my thing, or because Catherine naturally gravitated toward working with the mothers rather than the sister-in-law. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. I was being systematically excluded from my own family's biggest celebration. The realization hit me fully 6 months ago when Catherine called me directly for the first time since their engagement. She needed a graphic designer for their wedding invitations, and someone had told her I did that kind of work. The conversation was friendly but stilted, like she was talking to a vendor rather than a family member. Jessica, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I'm in a bit of a bind with our wedding stationery. Our original designer had a family emergency and had to back out. I know you do graphic design work, and I was wondering if you might be able to help us out. I was honestly shocked that she was reaching out. For months, I'd been watching from the periphery as wedding plans progressed without any input or involvement from me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Here was finally an opportunity to contribute something meaningful to Tim's special day. Of course, Catherine. I'd love to help with your wedding stationery. Do you have a vision in mind, or would you like to see some of my portfolio pieces? First, what followed was the most extensive design project I'd ever taken on. Catherine wanted a complete wedding suite, save the dates, invitations, RSVP cards, ceremony programs, menu cards, table numbers, welcome signs, and thank you cards. She had specific ideas about color schemes, typography, and overall aesthetic. She wanted something elegant and timeless that would photograph beautifully and impress her guests. I threw myself into the project with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. This wasn't just another client job. This was my chance to contribute something beautiful and meaningful to my brother's wedding. I researched calligraphy styles, sourced specialty papers, and designed multiple iterations of every piece until Catherine was completely satisfied. The process took 3 weeks of intensive work. I barely took on other clients during that time because I was so focused on making Tim and Catherine's wedding stationery absolutely perfect. When I finally presented the complete suite, Catherine was genuinely emotional. "Jessica, these are incredible. They're exactly what I envisioned, but even more beautiful than I could have imagined. You're so talented." For the first time in years, I felt truly valued by my family. Here was something I could contribute that no one else could do. My artistic abilities, which had always been dismissed as impractical, were finally being appreciated and needed. Then came the conversation about payment. Catherine mentioned wanting to keep things in the family and asked about my family discount rate. I was so happy to finally be included in something meaningful that I barely charged her anything. The entire project, which should have cost upward of $3,000, I invoiced for $800, basically covering just the cost of materials and printing. Catherine seemed delighted with the arrangement, and I felt good about being able to give them something special as my wedding gift. The stationery was printed and mailed, and based on the responses I was hearing, everyone was impressed with the design quality. That should have been the end of it. I should have felt satisfied that I'd contributed something beautiful to Tim's wedding and that Catherine seemed genuinely appreciative of my work. Instead, what happened next was a betrayal. That still makes my stomach clench when I think about it. 2 weeks after the invitations went out, I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw a post from Catherine tagged with several wedding vendors. The caption read, "So grateful for all the amazing vendors helping make our dream wedding come true. Special shout out to Elegance Designs for creating the most beautiful wedding stationery we could have imagined." My heart stopped. Elegance Designs was a high-end stationery company in the South End that charged premium prices for custom work. I clicked through to their Instagram and found my designs prominently featured in their portfolio, credited as their work for Tim and Catherine's wedding. Catherine had taken my designs, my work, my contribution to their special day, and given credit to another company. Not only had she denied me recognition for 3 weeks of intensive creative work, but she'd actually promoted another business using my designs. I called her immediately. "Catherine, I just saw your Instagram post about the wedding vendors. I think there might be a mistake with the stationery credit." There was a pause. "Oh, Jessica, I meant to talk to you about that. Elegance Designs handled all the printing and coordination, so we wanted to give them credit for the final product. I hope you understand." "But I designed everything. The printing was just executing my designs." Another pause. Longer this time. "Well, yes, but they really pulled everything together and made it look professional. I think it's appropriate to credit the company that handled the final production." I was stunned. Not only was she refusing to acknowledge my creative work, but she was implying that my designs somehow weren't professional until another company touched them. "Catherine, I spent 3 weeks creating those designs from scratch. Elegance Designs just printed them. That's like crediting the copy shop for writing a book." "Jessica, I don't want to argue about this. We're family, and family helps each other without expecting recognition. I thought you understood that." The conversation ended with me more confused and hurt than angry. Was I being unreasonable? Was expecting credit for my work somehow selfish? Or ungrateful? Catherine made it sound like I was being petty for wanting acknowledgement. But something about the whole situation felt deeply wrong. That's when Rachel got involved. Rachel Martinez has been my best friend since college, and she works as an event coordinator for a high-end catering company in Charlotte. She understands the wedding industry, vendor relationships, and how credit and recognition work in the creative services world. When I told her what happened with the stationery, her reaction was immediate and decisive. "Jessica, that's completely unacceptable. In our industry, design credit is sacred. You don't take someone's creative work and attribute it to another vendor. That's not just rude. It's essentially theft of intellectual property." Rachel's indignation was validating, but what she said next was what really opened my eyes. And the fact that she's calling it a family favor while simultaneously promoting another business using your work, that's manipulation. She's using your family relationship to exploit your professional skills while denying you the professional benefits of the work. I hadn't thought about it that way, but Rachel was right. Catherine had asked me to work for free as a family member, but then treated the results as if they came from a professional vendor. I was getting the worst of both worlds: no payment and no credit. But Rachel wasn't finished. "Jessica, I've been thinking about some things I've observed about your family dynamics, and I'm wondering if this stationary situation is part of a bigger pattern. Can I ask you something? How involved have you been in the actual wedding planning?" The question caught me off guard because the answer was so obvious I'd never really examined it. I haven't been involved at all, really. I mean, I hear about things after decisions are made, but I'm not included in the planning process. "Are you in the wedding party?" "No, but Catherine has a lot of sisters and college friends, so I didn't really expect." "Jessica, you're the groom's only sister. In most families, the sister of the groom has some kind of role in the wedding, even if it's just a reading or helping with hosting duties." I hadn't thought about it that way either. I'd been so conditioned to accept my peripheral role in family events that I hadn't considered whether my level of exclusion was normal. What about the engagement party, the showers, the bachelor and bachelorette parties? How involved were you in any of those events? As Rachel asked the question, I realized the answer was embarrassing. I wasn't involved in planning any of those events. I was invited to attend some of them, but always as a guest, never as a family member with any hosting or organizing responsibilities. "Rachel, I think I've been excluded from everything except actually being invited, and even that felt like an obligation rather than a choice." "Honey, that's not normal family dynamics. The groom's sister should be involved in at least some of the wedding planning, especially if she lives in the same city and has relevant professional skills." That conversation with Rachel was the beginning of my awakening to how abnormal my family dynamics had become. But it was also the beginning of something else. Rachel's suggestion that we investigate exactly how my family was able to afford this elaborate wedding in the first place. "Jessica, I coordinate events for wealthy families all the time, and Tim and Catherine's wedding sounds expensive, really expensive. I'm talking probably $60,000 to $80,000 expensive. Does that sound right for Tim's income level?" I had to think about it. Tim did well for himself, and Catherine had a good job in marketing, but they were also relatively young and had student loans. The wedding did seem extravagant for their circumstances. "I don't know, Rachel. My parents have been talking about how they want to give Tim the wedding of his dreams, and they've been pretty secretive about the financial details." "What about your grandmother's inheritance? Didn't you say your parents were managing that money for you?" "My grandmother, Popo, had died 2 years earlier and left a substantial inheritance. She'd owned property in Taiwan that had appreciated significantly over the years, and she'd also been a meticulous saver. When the inheritance was settled, my parents explained that the money would be held in a family trust to be managed responsibly and distributed when I was ready to make major life decisions like buying a house or starting a family. At the time, I was grateful for their management. The inheritance was substantial enough to be intimidating, and I was busy building my business. Having my parents handle the financial details seemed practical and responsible. They've been managing it, but I haven't really asked for specifics. They said it's invested and growing, and I'll have access to it when I need it for something important. Rachel looked at me for a long moment. Jessica, I think we need to find out exactly how that money is being managed, and I think we need to understand the timeline of when Tim's wedding planning started in relation to when your inheritance became available. That conversation happened 3 weeks ago, and it started the most intense investigation of my own family that I never wanted to conduct. Rachel, who has connections throughout Charlotte's event planning industry, started making discreet inquiries about Tim and Catherine's wedding vendors and expenses. Meanwhile, I began the uncomfortable process of requesting financial information about my own inheritance. What we discovered was so shocking that I'm still processing the implications. The beautiful wedding that my family has been planning for over a year, the wedding that I've been systematically excluded from while being exploited for free professional services, has been funded entirely by my grandmother's inheritance. The inheritance that was supposed to provide me with financial security and independence has instead been used to pay for my brother's elaborate celebration while I've been treated like a peripheral family member whose contributions are useful, but not worthy of recognition or inclusion. The venue contract in my lap, signed with my legal name and paid for with funds from the Jessica Chen Family Trust, is just one piece of evidence in a folder full of documents that tell the story of financial betrayal and emotional manipulation that has been going on for 2 years. Tonight, sitting outside Rosewood Gardens Event Center, I'm not just the excluded sister anymore. I'm the person who's been paying for the party all along, and it's time for my family to understand exactly what that means. The morning after my conversation with Rachel, I woke up with a determination I hadn't felt in years. For too long, I'd accepted my family's explanations without question, trusted their management of my affairs because challenging them felt disrespectful. But Rachel's questions had planted seeds of doubt that were growing into full-blown suspicion. I started by calling Piedmont Trust Services, the company my parents said was managing my inheritance. When Popo died, Dad had explained that her estate needed professional management due to the complexity of international assets and tax implications. At 27 and overwhelmed by grief, I'd been grateful that he was handling the details. Good morning, Piedmont Trust Services. This is Amanda speaking. Hi, Amanda. My name is Jessica Chen, and I'm calling to inquire about a trust account that should be under my name. My parents set it up about 2 years ago to manage an inheritance. There was a pause and some typing. I'm showing a Chen family trust established in 2022, but the primary account holder is listed as David Chen. Are you perhaps an authorized user on that account? My stomach dropped. I was told this trust was set up specifically for my inheritance from my grandmother. Can you tell me what the account designation shows? I can only provide limited information over the phone, but the account is titled Chen Family Trust for Estate Management and Distribution. The beneficiaries listed are David Chen, Margaret Chen, and Timothy Chen. I don't see a Jessica Chen listed as a beneficiary. The words hit me like a physical blow. My inheritance, my grandmother's money that was supposed to secure my future, was in a trust that didn't even list me as a beneficiary. My parents and brother were the only ones with legal access to funds that came from Popo's estate specifically, intended for me. Is there any way to get more detailed information about this account? I believe there may have been an error in the beneficiary designation. Amanda's voice became more cautious. You would need to provide proper identification and legal documentation showing your relationship to the estate. You could also contact our legal department if you believe there's been an error in the trust setup. I hung up feeling sick. Either my parents had made a terrible mistake in setting up the trust, or they had deliberately excluded me from access to my own inheritance, given the pattern of exclusion I was starting to recognize in other areas of my life I suspected it wasn't a mistake. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house in Myers Park. The neighborhood was quiet, with its tree-lined streets and manicured lawns that spoke of quiet prosperity. Growing up here, I'd felt secure and privileged. Now, walking up the familiar brick walkway, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. Mom was in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for dinner with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. She looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across her face. "Jessica, honey, what brings you by? I wasn't expecting you today." "Hi, Mom. I wanted to talk to you and Dad about Popo's inheritance. I've been thinking about my financial planning, and I realized I don't really understand how the trust works." Her hands stilled on the carrots she was chopping. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about those details. Your father handles all of that, and everything is being managed very responsibly. When you're ready to buy a house or make other major life decisions, we'll make sure you have access to what you need." The phrase "what you need" struck me as odd. Not "what's yours" or "your inheritance," but what I needed, as determined by them. "I'd still like to understand the details, Mom. Could I see the trust documents or talk to Dad about how it's structured?" She resumed chopping, her movements becoming more aggressive. "Jessica, I don't understand this sudden interest in financial details. You've never been concerned about money management before. Is everything okay with your business?" The deflection was subtle but clear. Instead of answering my questions about the trust, she was questioning my motives for asking. It was a classic technique I was beginning to recognize from years of similar conversations. "My business is fine, Mom. I just think I'm old enough to understand how my own inheritance is being managed. Your father will be home soon. You can discuss it with him then." Dad's reaction was more direct but equally evasive. When I asked about the trust structure and why I wasn't listed as a beneficiary, he became defensive. "Jessica, I don't appreciate the implication that we've done something wrong with your grandmother's money. Everything we've done has been in your best interest and completely legal. I'm not implying anything's wrong, Dad. I just want to understand why I'm not listed as a beneficiary on a trust that was created for my inheritance. The trust was structured to protect the assets until you demonstrate the maturity to handle them responsibly. Your grandmother worked her entire life to build that wealth, and we're not going to let it be wasted on impulsive decisions." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. At 29, having built a successful business and lived independently for years, I was still being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted with money. What kind of decisions would qualify as mature enough to access my own inheritance? Marriage, home ownership, starting a family. Real-life milestones that show you're ready for serious financial responsibility. I thought about Tim's wedding, expenses, and wondered if getting married automatically qualified someone for financial responsibility, or if the trust money paying for his celebration was somehow different. "Dad, can you show me the trust documents? I'd like to review exactly how it's structured and what the distribution criteria are." His face hardened. "Jessica, this interrogation is inappropriate and frankly insulting. We've managed this family's finances responsibly for decades, and I don't appreciate having my judgment questioned by someone who's never shown any interest in financial planning." The conversation ended with me leaving more confused and frustrated than when I arrived. Not only had I not gotten answers to my questions, but I'd been made to feel ungrateful and immature for asking them. It was a familiar dynamic, but now I was beginning to see it as manipulation rather than justified concern. That evening, I called Rachel and recounted both conversations. Her reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Jessica, something is very wrong here. First, you're not listed as a beneficiary on a trust created for your inheritance. Second, your parents are refusing to show you legal documents that should be yours to review. Third, they're using emotional manipulation to avoid answering legitimate questions. But what if they're right? What if I am being ungrateful and immature? Honey, asking to see financial documents related to your own inheritance isn't ungrateful. It's basic adult responsibility. The fact that they're making you feel bad for asking suggests they have something to hide. Rachel's next suggestion changed everything. I have a friend who works in estate law. Would you be willing to have her review what we know so far and advise us on next steps? 2 days later, I found myself in the downtown office of Melissa Torres, a sharp-eyed attorney who specialized in estate and trust law. Rachel had explained the basic situation, and Melissa had agreed to a consultation to help me understand my legal rights. Jessica, based on what Rachel has told me, there are several red flags in how your inheritance has been handled. Let's start with the basics. Do you have a copy of your grandmother's will? I shook my head. My parents handled the estate settlement. They said the will was complicated because of international assets and that I didn't need to worry about the details. Melissa made a note. In North Carolina, wills are public documents. Once they've been probated, we can request a copy from the court system. What about the trust documents? They won't show them to me. They say I don't need to see them because they're managing everything responsibly. That's problematic. If you're supposed to be a beneficiary of this trust, you have a legal right to review the documents and understand how it's structured. The fact that they're refusing suggests either gross misunderstanding of fiduciary responsibility or deliberate concealment. Melissa explained that as a trust beneficiary, I had specific legal rights, including the right to receive regular accounting of trust assets and activities, the right to review trust documents, and the right to petition the court if I believed the trust was being mismanaged. However, she continued, if you're not actually listed as a beneficiary, that changes things significantly. We need to find out exactly how this trust is structured and whether your inheritance was properly transferred into it. She suggested starting with a formal request for trust documents and account statements. If my parents refused, we could pursue legal channels to obtain the information. There's one more thing we should investigate immediately, Melissa said. Rachel mentioned that your brother is having an expensive wedding. Do you know if any family money is being used for wedding expenses? I don't know the details, but my parents have been talking about wanting to give Tim the wedding of his dreams. I assumed they were paying for it out of their regular income. Let's find out. Wedding vendors typically require substantial deposits and payments over time. If trust money is being used for wedding expenses, that would be a clear misuse of assets intended for your benefit. Melissa's matter-of-fact approach to investigating my family's financial activities felt both validating and terrifying. For the first time, someone was treating my concerns as legitimate rather than ungrateful, but the implications of what we might discover were overwhelming. Over the next week, Melissa filed formal requests for copies of Popo's will and the trust documents. What we received was shocking in its clarity and devastating in its implications. Popo's will explicitly left her entire estate to me, with the exception of small personal gifts to other family members. The language was unambiguous. To my beloved granddaughter, Jessica Chen, who has brought joy and creativity to our family, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all property, investments, and personal assets, with the hope that this inheritance will provide her with the independence and security to pursue her dreams. The trust documents told a different story. The Chen family trust had been established with my inheritance as the principal asset, but the distribution language gave my parents complete discretionary authority over when and how much money I could access. Tim was listed as a co-beneficiary, meaning he had equal rights to distributions from what should have been my inheritance. Most damaging were the trust account statements. Over the past 2 years, substantial withdrawals had been made for various expenses, many of which appeared to be related to Tim's wedding and lifestyle. The venue deposit, catering payments, florist fees, and even Catherine's wedding dress had all been paid from trust funds that originated from my grandmother's estate. Jessica, Melissa said gently as we reviewed the documents, your family has essentially stolen your inheritance and used it to fund your brother's wedding while excluding you from the celebration. This isn't a family disagreement about financial management. This is a clear case of trust mismanagement and potentially criminal fraud. Armed with the devastating truth about my inheritance, I began to see my family's behavior over the past 2 years in a completely different light. Every conversation about Tim's wedding expenses, every comment about my parents' generosity in funding the celebration, every discussion about my own financial future had been built on lies and manipulation. But the financial betrayal was only part of the story. As I began to examine my exclusion from wedding planning more carefully, I realized that my marginalization hadn't been accidental or even just family preference. It had been a deliberate campaign to ensure I never became involved enough to discover how the wedding was being funded. The pattern became clear when I started reconstructing the timeline of wedding planning activities. The engagement party had been planned and executed while I was dealing with a major project deadline that kept me busy for weeks. The couple's shower happened during a weekend when I was visiting a college friend in Atlanta. The venue tours and vendor meetings consistently occurred on days when I had other commitments or wasn't specifically invited. At the time, I'd interpreted these scheduling conflicts as unfortunate coincidence or evidence that I wasn't really needed for wedding planning. Now I wondered if the conflicts had been deliberately created to keep me away from situations where I might learn too much about wedding expenses. Rachel had been conducting her own investigation through her contacts in Charlotte's wedding industry. What she discovered added another layer to the deception that was taking place. Jessica, I've been talking to vendors who are working on Tim's wedding, and there are some strange things about how payments are being handled. We were sitting in her apartment surrounded by wedding vendor contact lists and expense estimates that Rachel had compiled through her professional network. Most of the major vendors have been paid unusual large deposits, sometimes the full amount, months in advance. That's not typical for most families, even wealthy ones. Usually people pay smaller deposits and then pay the balance closer to the wedding date. What does that suggest? It suggests someone with access to a large amount of liquid cash who wanted to lock in vendors and prices early. But here's the weird part. Several vendors mentioned that the person handling payments seemed very concerned about keeping expense details confidential. Rachel had spoken with the florist, the photographer, and the cake designer, all of whom reported similar experiences. The person arranging payments, who they understood to be the mother of the groom, had specifically requested that all financial communications go through her directly, rather than including other family members in email chains or planning discussions. Your mom basically created an information firewall around wedding expenses. The vendors were told that some family members were sensitive about money discussions, and that financial details should be kept private. The manipulation was sophisticated and systematic. By controlling vendor communications and scheduling planning activities around my availability, my parents had ensured that I remained completely ignorant about how much money was being spent and where it was coming from. But the financial deception wasn't the only troubling discovery Rachel had made. Through her industry contacts, she'd also learned about the guest list management for Tim's wedding. Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How many people do you know personally who are invited to Tim's wedding? The question surprised me. I don't know exact numbers. Family members, some of Tim's college friends, Catherine's family and friends. Why? I saw a preliminary guest list when I was talking to the catering coordinator. Your extended family is invited, Tim's college friends, Catherine's family, and social circle, and quite a few of your parents' professional and social contacts. But I didn't see many people who seemed connected to you specifically. I thought about it and realized Rachel was right. My college friends weren't invited. My professional contacts weren't included. Even my closest family friends, people who had known me since childhood, didn't seem to be on the guest list. It's like they planned a wedding guest list that represents Tim's life and your parents' social circle, but not your life at all, even though you're paying for it. The realization was humiliating. Not only had I been excluded from planning and decision-making for an event funded by my inheritance, but the guest list had been curated to minimize my connections and maximize everyone else's. I was going to be a stranger at a party I was paying for. That evening, I decided to test my growing suspicions by asking my parents directly about wedding expenses. I called during their usual dinner time, when they'd be together and potentially off guard. "Hi, Mom. It's Jessica. I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." "Not at all, sweetheart. Your father and I were just finishing up. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about Tim's wedding, and I'm curious about how you and Dad are managing to afford such an elaborate celebration. The venue and everything sounds really expensive." There was a pause. "Oh, Jessica, you don't need to worry about those details. Your father and I have been planning for this for years. We want to give Tim and Catherine the wedding they deserve." "I'm not worried, Mom. I'm just impressed. Rosewood Gardens is supposed to be one of the most expensive venues in Charlotte. You and Dad must have done really well with your investments." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, we've been fortunate, and we've made some smart financial decisions over the years." "Like what kind of decisions? I'm trying to learn more about financial planning myself." "Jessica, I'm not sure why you're suddenly so interested in our financial affairs. Is there something specific you need money for?" The deflection was becoming a familiar pattern. Instead of answering questions about their financial capacity, they questioned my motives for asking. "I don't need money, Mom. I'm just curious about how you're affording everything. Has any family money been used for wedding expenses?" "What do you mean by family money?" "Like the inheritance from Popo. Has any of that been used for Tim's wedding?" The silence that followed was deafening. When Mom finally spoke, her voice was tight and defensive. "Jessica, your grandmother's money is being managed responsibly for the entire family's benefit. If some of those funds have been used for important family celebrations, that's exactly the kind of thing your grandmother would have wanted." "But Mom, Popo left that money specifically to me. Shouldn't I have a say in how it's used?" "Sweetheart, you're being very selfish right now. This is Tim's wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime celebration for your brother. The fact that you're worried about money when we're trying to create beautiful memories for our family is frankly disappointing." The conversation ended with me feeling gaslit and manipulated, but also more certain than ever that my suspicions were correct. My parents had used my inheritance to fund Tim's wedding, and when directly confronted, they'd admitted it while simultaneously making me feel guilty for questioning their decision. While Melissa was helping me understand the legal implications of the financial betrayal, I was also grappling with the professional and personal humiliation of the wedding stationery situation. What had initially seemed like a disappointing family slight was beginning to reveal itself as part of a larger pattern of exploitation and manipulation. Rachel suggested that I document exactly what had happened with the stationery design and credit theft, both for my own understanding and as potential evidence of my family's willingness to exploit my professional skills while denying me recognition. I gathered all my communication with Catherine about the project, from her initial request for help through the final delivery of printed materials. Reading through the email chain with fresh eyes, I began to notice things that hadn't bothered me at the time but now seemed problematic. Catherine's initial request had been framed as an emergency situation where I was doing the family a favor by stepping in after their original designer backed out. But when I checked the timeline, I realized that Catherine had contacted me 7 months before the wedding, which was hardly last minute by wedding planning standards. "Jessica, I hate to impose, but I'm in a real bind and hoping you might be able to help us out," had been her opening line. But 7 months was plenty of time to find and work with any professional designer in Charlotte. The emergency framing had been designed to make me feel like I was doing them a favor that deserved gratitude rather than payment. Her communication throughout the project had also been subtly condescending in ways I hadn't fully recognized. She'd frequently praised my little design business and expressed surprise when my work met professional standards. "This looks so professional. I'm impressed," had been her response to my first draft, as if she'd expected amateur quality work. Most telling were her communications about payment. When I'd offered the family discount rate, her response had been effusive. "Jessica, you're so generous. This is exactly why family is so important. I know Tim is lucky to have such a talented and giving sister." The language was manipulative in its emotional appeal. By framing my discount as generosity rather than professional courtesy, she'd made it difficult for me to later request fair compensation without seeming greedy or ungrateful. But the real betrayal had come with the credit theft. I'd saved screenshots of Elegance Design's Instagram posts featuring my work, and when I examined them closely, I realized the violation was even worse than I'd initially understood. Not only had they posted my designs as examples of their own work, but they'd also included detailed descriptions of their design process that described creative decisions I had made. They were literally taking credit for my creative thinking and artistic vision, not just the final printed products. The post read, "We're so proud of this elegant wedding suite we created for Tim and Catherine. Our design team spent weeks perfecting the calligraphy style and color palette to capture the sophisticated, timeless aesthetic they wanted. Every detail was carefully considered to ensure the stationery would photograph beautifully and set the perfect tone for their celebration." Every word of that description referred to work I had done: the calligraphy style research, the color palette, development, the photographic considerations. All of it had been my creative process, my design thinking, my professional expertise. Elegance Designs had somehow been given permission to claim my intellectual property as their own work. I called Catherine to confront her about the Instagram posts, but her response revealed how calculated the entire situation had been. "Jessica, I think you're overreacting. Elegance Designs handled all the vendor coordination and final production. It makes sense for them to include the project in their portfolio. Catherine, they're describing my design process as their own work. They're taking credit for creative decisions I made. Well, they did add their professional expertise to polish everything up. I think it's fair for them to showcase the final result." "What professional expertise? I designed everything. They just printed it." "Jessica, I really don't want to argue about this. The important thing is that we have beautiful wedding stationery, and everyone contributed to making that happen." The phrase, "everyone contributed," was particularly galling. I had contributed weeks of unpaid creative work. Elegance Designs had contributed standard printing services for which they were being paid. But in Catherine's framing, our contributions were equivalent, and the final result was somehow a collaborative effort rather than my work being executed by their printing services. When I pressed her about correcting the credit on social media, her response revealed the deliberate nature of the deception. "I already posted about the vendors we're using. I can't go back and change things now without confusing people. Besides, I think you're being overly sensitive about this. We're family, and family supports each other without keeping score." The family supports each other argument was becoming a frequent refrain whenever I questioned treatment that seemed unfair. It was a manipulation technique that used my desire for family connection to excuse behavior that would never be acceptable in a professional context. But what made the stationery situation particularly painful was realizing that Catherine had never intended to give me credit for the work. The Instagram post crediting Elegance Designs had gone up the same day the invitations were mailed, suggesting that the social media strategy had been planned in advance. She had always intended to use my work to promote another business. Rachel's reaction to the stationery situation was more outraged than mine had been. "Jessica, this isn't just family drama. This is theft of intellectual property. In the design industry, portfolio credit is how professionals build their reputations and attract new clients. By allowing another company to take credit for your work, Catherine has literally stolen potential business from you." Rachel was right. The wedding stationery market in Charlotte was competitive, and having high-profile work in my portfolio could have led to other lucrative projects. Instead, those opportunities were now benefiting Elegance Designs, who had done nothing more than print my designs. And the fact that she's refusing to correct the credit even after you've explained the problem shows this wasn't an innocent mistake. She knows exactly what she's doing. The more I examined the stationery situation, the more it seemed connected to the broader pattern of exclusion and exploitation I was discovering. My family was comfortable using my professional skills when they needed them, but they weren't willing to give me the recognition or respect that should have come with my contributions. It was a microcosm of how they treated me generally. Useful, when convenient, but not valued enough to include, credit, or compensate fairly. As I continued investigating my family's treatment of me, I began to recognize that the wedding planning exclusion was just the most recent example of a pattern that had been escalating for years. What I had interpreted as personality differences or natural family dynamics was actually a systematic campaign to marginalize me while benefiting from my resources and skills. The pattern became most obvious when I started documenting family events and my role in them over the past several years. I created a timeline that tracked family celebrations, who was involved in planning them, and what my participation looked like compared to other family members. Tim's college graduation celebration had been a weekend-long affair with a dinner party at my parents' house, a brunch at the country club, and a family trip to the mountains. I had been invited to attend all the events, but hadn't been included in planning any of them. When I'd offered to help with preparations, Mom had said they had everything under control. Catherine's birthday party last year had been an elaborate surprise party that involved weeks of coordination between my parents, Tim, and Catherine's family. I'd found out about it 2 days before when Mom casually mentioned that I should plan to attend. When I'd asked why I hadn't been included in the planning, she'd said they wanted to keep the guest list small for planning purposes. My own birthday. Celebrations over the same period had been casual family dinners with minimal fanfare. Not because I preferred low-key celebrations, but because no one had asked what I wanted or offered to organize anything more elaborate. The pattern extended beyond social events to family financial decisions and support systems. When Tim had been looking for his first apartment after college, my parents had spent weekends touring properties with him and had contributed to his security deposit. When I'd been apartment hunting the year before, I'd done everything independently and hadn't been offered financial assistance. When Tim had wanted to take the expensive vacation to Europe with Catherine, my parents had surprised him with airline tickets as an early Christmas gift. When I'd mentioned wanting to take a professional development trip to a design conference in New York, I'd been told that travel was a luxury I should fund myself once my business was more established. The P's financial support disparities were particularly striking when viewed alongside the discovery that my inheritance was being used for family expenses. My parents were comfortable using my money to fund Tim's lifestyle, while simultaneously telling me that I needed to be more financially responsible before I could access those same funds. But the emotional exclusion was perhaps more damaging than the financial manipulation. I began to notice how family conversations were structured to minimize my contributions and maximize everyone else's achievements. At family dinners, Tim's work stories dominated conversation. His latest client success, his promotion opportunities, his professional travel, all of it was discussed with interest and enthusiasm. When I shared updates about my business, the conversation quickly shifted to other topics or was interrupted by questions about when I was going to pursue more stable employment. My parents' social conversations with friends and neighbors followed similar patterns. They were proud to discuss Tim's MBA, his job at a prestigious consulting firm, and his upcoming marriage to Catherine from a prominent local family. My graphic design business was mentioned, if at all, as a creative phase I was going through before settling down to more serious life pursuits. The message was clear. Tim's life and achievements mattered. Mine were temporary distractions from the real business of adult success. Even my relationship with extended family had been shaped by this dynamic. My aunts and uncles, my cousins and family friends, all seemed to have absorbed the narrative that Tim was the successful one, while I was still figuring things out. At family gatherings, conversations with relatives focused on Tim's accomplishments, while my presence was acknowledged but not celebrated. I began to wonder if my extended family even knew about my business success, or if they'd been told a different story about my life and career. The fact that none of my professional contacts or long-term friends were invited to Tim's wedding suggested that my parents might have been actively concealing the reality of my life from their social circle. The social isolation was particularly painful when I realized how effectively I'd been cut off from potential sources of support and advocacy within my own family network. By controlling the narrative about my life and achievements, my parents had ensured that no one else in the family would question my exclusion from important events or decisions. Rachel pointed out that this kind of systematic marginalization was a form of emotional abuse that was often difficult to recognize because it happened gradually and was disguised as family preference or natural dynamics. Jessica, healthy families celebrate all their members' achievements and include everyone in important decisions. The fact that you've been systematically excluded while your resources are being used for other people's benefit isn't normal family dysfunction. It's deliberate exploitation. Her observation forced me to confront the possibility that my family's treatment of me wasn't just unfortunate or unfair, but actually abusive. The thought was overwhelming because it meant that the people I'd been trying hardest to please and reconnect with were the same people who had been systematically undermining my financial security and emotional well-being. But it also explained why all my efforts to improve my standing in the family had failed. I'd been trying to earn acceptance and inclusion from people who had a vested interest in keeping me marginalized. My exclusion wasn't a problem to be solved through better behavior or greater achievements. It was a deliberate strategy that served their purposes. The realization was devastating, but also liberating. For the first time in years, my family's treatment of me made sense, not as a reflection of my inadequacies, but as a systematic campaign to exploit my resources while denying me agency and recognition. Armed with this understanding and the legal evidence Melissa had helped me gather, I was ready to move from discovery to action. The question was no longer whether my family had betrayed and exploited me. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was what I was going to do about it, and how much of my family relationships I was willing to sacrifice to demand justice and respect. The rehearsal dinner at Rosewood Gardens, funded by my inheritance and planned without my input, was going to be the perfect venue for those questions to be answered. The week leading up to Tim's rehearsal dinner was the most intense period of preparation I'd ever experienced. With Melissa's legal guidance and Rachel's emotional support, I was building not just a case for financial restitution, but a strategy for reclaiming my place in my own family, or definitively severing ties with people who had exploited me for years. Melissa had been working with forensic accountants to trace exactly how much of my inheritance had been misappropriated. The numbers were staggering and went far beyond wedding expenses. Over the past 2 years, the trust had funded Tim's graduate, school loans, a down payment on his and Catherine's townhouse, Catherine's car lease, and even my parents' kitchen renovation. My grandmother's life savings, intended to provide me with independence and security, had essentially subsidized my entire family's lifestyle, while I struggled to build my business and pay my own expenses. Jessica, the total misappropriation is approximately $240,000, Melissa explained during our final strategy meeting. That includes direct payments, loan guarantees, and asset purchases that should have required your explicit consent as the intended beneficiary. The amount was breathtaking. My grandmother had left me nearly $300,000, enough to buy a house, expand my business, or simply provide the financial security that would have allowed me to take creative risks without worrying about basic survival. Instead, that money had funded a lifestyle for my family that they couldn't afford on their own incomes, while I lived modestly and worried about quarterly tax payments. But the financial theft was only part of what we were preparing to address. Rachel had been documenting the social and professional exploitation through her industry contacts, building a comprehensive picture of how my family had deliberately undermined my career while benefiting from my skills. The stationary credit theft is just the tip of the iceberg, Rachel explained. I've been talking to other vendors, and your parents have been telling people that you're not really a serious professional designer. They've actually discouraged potential clients from working with you by suggesting that your business isn't stable or reliable. The revelation was crushing. While I'd been struggling to build my client base and establish credibility in Charlotte's competitive design market, my own parents had been actively sabotaging my professional reputation. They'd been using my skills when they needed them while simultaneously undermining my ability to attract paying clients. There's more, Rachel continued. Several vendors mentioned that your mother specifically requested that they not mention your involvement in Tim's wedding stationery if anyone asked about recommendations. She was actively preventing you from getting credit that could have led to new business. The strategic nature of the sabotage was becoming clear. My family hadn't just excluded me from social events or made me feel unwelcome. They had systematically undermined my financial independence and professional success while using my inheritance to fund their own prosperity. It was a coordinated campaign designed to keep me dependent and marginalized. Melissa suggested that we document everything comprehensively before confronting my family. Once you reveal what you know, they'll have the opportunity to destroy evidence or create alternative narratives. We need to ensure that we have complete documentation of the financial misappropriation and professional sabotage before they realize how much you've discovered. We spent 3 days gathering and organizing evidence. Bank statements showing trust fund withdrawals that corresponded to major purchases for Tim and Catherine. Email chains between my parents and wedding vendors that explicitly excluded me from communications about events I was funding. Screenshots of social media posts where my mother promoted other design businesses while never mentioning my work. Even recordings of phone conversations where my parents had discouraged potential clients from hiring me. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, but it was also emotionally devastating. Seeing the deliberate nature of my family's betrayal, documented so thoroughly, forced me to confront the reality that the people I'd been trying hardest to please had been actively working against my success and happiness. But the documentation process also revealed something else. My family's behavior toward me had escalated significantly since my grandmother's death. The financial exploitation had begun immediately after the inheritance became available, and the professional sabotage had intensified as my business started to succeed despite their interference. They were threatened by your independence, Rachel observed. As long as you were struggling financially and professionally, they could maintain control and justify their treatment of you. But once you started succeeding on your own terms, they needed to actively undermine you to maintain their narrative about your inadequacy. The insight was both validating and heartbreaking. My family's increasing cruelty hadn't been a response to any failure on my part. It had been a reaction to my success, a deliberate effort to prevent me from achieving the independence that would have allowed me to escape their manipulation. With the evidence compiled and our strategy finalized, we faced the question of timing and venue for confronting my family. Melissa had suggested a formal legal meeting, but I felt strongly that the confrontation needed to happen in a context that would expose their hypocrisy most dramatically. I want to do it at the rehearsal dinner, I told Rachel and Melissa. They're celebrating with my money at a venue I'm paying for while excluding me from the guest list. The symbolism is perfect. Rachel was concerned about the public nature of such a confrontation. Jessica, are you sure you want to do this in front of Catherine's family and all the wedding guests? Once you reveal everything, there's no going back. But that was exactly why I wanted to do it publicly. For years, my family had manipulated me through private conversations where they could gaslight me and make me doubt my own perceptions. They'd controlled the narrative by keeping financial and social information compartmentalized. A public confrontation would force them to address the evidence directly, rather than deflecting or manipulating me emotionally. They've humiliated me publicly for years by excluding me from events while telling other people I was too busy or disinterested to participate. It's time for them to experience some public accountability for their actions. Melissa agreed that the rehearsal dinner timing would be strategically effective. The contrast between their public celebration and your documented exclusion will be impossible to ignore, and having witnesses to their responses will prevent them from later claiming that the confrontation didn't happen the way you described. We developed a careful plan for the evening. I would arrive at Rosewood Gardens during the cocktail hour with Rachel as my support and Melissa as my legal representative. We would request a private conversation with my parents and Tim, but if they refused or became defensive, we would present the evidence publicly. The goal wasn't to ruin Tim's wedding celebration out of spite, but to force my family to acknowledge what they'd done and commit to making amends. If they were willing to admit their behavior and agree to financial restitution, we could handle the situation discreetly. If they continued to deny or minimize their actions, the public exposure would serve as both accountability and protection for me. Remember, Melissa advised, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice and establishing boundaries. Your family has exploited you because they believed there would be no consequences. Tonight, they'll learn that there are consequences, and those consequences will be proportional to their willingness to take responsibility. The day of the rehearsal dinner, I spent hours preparing mentally and emotionally for what was going to be the most difficult conversation of my life. I practiced presenting the evidence calmly and factually, focusing on documentation rather than emotions. I rehearsed responses to the defensive reactions I anticipated from my parents and Tim. But most importantly, I prepared myself for the possibility that this confrontation would end my relationship with my family permanently. As painful as that prospect was, I'd come to understand that maintaining relationships built on exploitation and disrespect was more damaging than having no family relationships at all. Rachel helped me choose my outfit. An elegant navy dress. That was formal enough for the venue, but not so dressy that I'd look like I was trying to upstage the bride. The goal was to appear confident and professional, someone who deserved to be taken seriously rather than dismissed or patronized. You look like someone who knows her worth, Rachel said as we prepared to leave for Rosewood Gardens. And that's exactly who you need to be tonight. Driving to Rosewood Gardens felt surreal, like approaching the scene of a crime in progress, which, I realized, was essentially what it was. My family was celebrating with stolen money at a venue they had no right to use, surrounded by people who had been told lies about why I wasn't included in the celebration. The venue was even more beautiful than I'd remembered from my brief visit months earlier. The gardens were meticulously maintained, with white lights strung through the trees creating a magical ambiance. The stone terrace where cocktails were being served overlooked a small lake, and the elegant ballroom visible through tall windows looked like something from a fairy tale. It should have been a perfect setting for celebrating my brother's happiness. Instead, it felt like a monument to my family's willingness to steal from me while making me feel unworthy of inclusion. Rachel parked near the main entrance, and we sat for a moment watching well-dressed guests arriving for the rehearsal dinner. I recognized some of my extended family members, my parents' friends and neighbors, and what appeared to be Catherine's extensive family network. Everyone looked happy and excited, dressed for celebration, completely unaware that the beautiful evening they were enjoying had been funded through financial fraud. "Are you ready for this?" Rachel asked gently. I looked at the folder of evidence in my lap, thought about my grandmother's intentions for her inheritance, and considered the years of manipulation and exploitation that had led to this moment. "I'm ready." Melissa met us at the entrance, looking every inch the professional attorney in her crisp suit and carrying a leather briefcase that I knew contained additional copies of all our documentation. Her presence was both reassuring and intimidating, a visible reminder that this wasn't just a family disagreement, but a legal matter with serious consequences. We walked through the elegant lobby toward the terrace where cocktails were being served. The sound of laughter and conversation grew louder as we approached, and I could see the warm glow of lights and hear the gentle music that provided ambiance for the celebration. As we stepped onto the terrace, the conversations around us gradually quieted. Heads turned, curious expressions replaced social smiles, and I could feel the weight of surprised attention as people registered my unexpected presence. My mother spotted me first. She was standing near the bar with Catherine's mother, both women elegantly dressed and obviously enjoying their roles as hostesses for this sophisticated gathering. When she saw me, her champagne glass paused halfway to her lips, and her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then a carefully controlled smile. "Jessica," she said, approaching us with the kind of forced warmth that I'd learned to recognize as her public persona. "What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you this evening." The phrase was carefully chosen. Not "you weren't invited" or "you shouldn't be here," but "I wasn't expecting you," which implied that my presence was merely unexpected rather than explicitly unwelcome. "Hello, Mom," I replied calmly. "I hope you don't mind that I brought some friends. This is Melissa Torres, my attorney, and you already know Rachel." The word attorney had the effect I'd hoped for. Mom's smile became more strained, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to understand why I would bring legal representation to a family celebration. "Your attorney?" she repeated, her voice carefully controlled but with an edge of concern. "Jessica, this is Tim's rehearsal dinner. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for whatever business matter you need to discuss." Before I could respond, Tim appeared at Mom's side. He looked handsome in his navy blazer, every inch the successful young professional celebrating his upcoming marriage. When he saw me, his expression was more openly annoyed than Mom's carefully controlled surprise. "Jessica, what are you doing here? Mom told you this was just for the wedding party and immediate family." The phrase "immediate family" stung, especially knowing that I was more immediately connected to this celebration than anyone else present, given that my inheritance was funding it. "Hello, Tim," I said evenly. "Congratulations on your engagement. You have a beautiful venue here." Something in my tone must have warned him that this wasn't a typical family interaction, because his annoyance shifted to wariness. "Thanks. But seriously, what are you doing here? And why did you bring an attorney to my rehearsal dinner?" By now, our conversation was attracting attention from other guests. Catherine appeared at Tim's side, looking stunning in a pale pink dress that I suddenly wondered if my inheritance had paid for. Her expression was openly hostile as she took in my presence and that of my companions. "Jessica, this is incredibly inappropriate," Catherine said, her voice loud enough that nearby guests could hear. "This is supposed to be an intimate celebration with our closest family and friends. Bringing strangers to crash our party is beyond rude." The word "strangers," applied to Rachel and Melissa, was clearly intended to emphasize that I was an outsider, bringing inappropriate intrusions into their private celebration. But it also gave me the opening I needed to begin addressing the reality of the situation. "Actually, Catherine, I'm not crashing anything. This is my venue." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Conversations around us stopped entirely as people processed what I'd said. Mom's face went pale, Tim looked confused, and Catherine's hostility shifted to bewilderment. "What do you mean, your venue?" Tim asked. I opened the folder and pulled out the venue contract, holding it so the letterhead and signature lines were visible. "I mean, the contract for Rosewood Gardens is in my name. The payments have come from my bank account. And, legally, I'm the client responsible for tonight's event." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the attention of every guest on the terrace focused on our small group as the implications of my statement began to sink in. Mom recovered first, her expression shifting to the kind of patronizing concern she'd always used to make me doubt my own perceptions. "Jessica, sweetheart, I think there's been some confusion. Your father and I have been handling the wedding arrangements, and paying for them with my inheritance from Popo," I interrupted, my voice clear and carrying across the quiet terrace. "The inheritance that was supposed to provide me with financial security but has instead funded Tim's wedding, his student loans, and even your kitchen renovation." The accusations were specific and serious enough that they couldn't be dismissed as confusion or misunderstanding. Tim's face showed genuine shock, suggesting that he might not have known the source of his wedding funding. But Mom and Dad, who had appeared at the sound of raised voices, both looked like people who had been caught in serious wrongdoing. "Jessica, this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion," Dad said firmly, trying to assert paternal authority to shut down the confrontation. "We can talk about family financial matters privately at home." But I was done allowing them to control when and how we addressed their exploitation of me. For years, they'd used private conversations to gaslight me and avoid accountability. Tonight, with witnesses present and evidence in hand, they were going to face the consequences of their actions. "Actually, Dad, this is exactly the time and place. You've excluded me from family celebrations while using my money to pay for them. You've told people I was too busy or disinterested to participate while actively preventing me from being involved. Tonight, everyone gets to understand exactly how this beautiful celebration has been funded and why I wasn't invited to enjoy the party I'm paying for." The moment had arrived for what Melissa and I had carefully planned as the evidence presentation phase of our confrontation. The initial shock of my accusations was wearing off, and I could see my parents beginning to formulate defensive responses. Before they could regain control of the narrative, I needed to present the documentation that would make denial impossible. "Melissa," I said, turning to my attorney, "would you please show my family the financial records we've compiled?" Melissa opened her briefcase with professional efficiency and pulled out a thick folder of documents. The sight of official paperwork immediately changed the atmosphere on the terrace. This was no longer a family squabble that could be dismissed or deflected. This was a legal matter with serious implications. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, Timothy, I'm Melissa Torres, and I represent Jessica in matters related to the estate of her grandmother and the mismanagement of her inheritance," Melissa began in her clear, professional voice that carried easily across the now silent terrace. "Over the past 3 weeks, we've conducted a comprehensive audit of the Chen Family Trust and discovered systematic misappropriation of funds intended exclusively for Jessica's benefit." She handed my father a copy of Popo's will, open to the relevant section. As you can see, Jessica's grandmother explicitly left her entire estate to Jessica, with the exception of small personal gifts to other family members. The language is unambiguous about the intended beneficiary. Dad took the document but didn't look at it, his face already showing the strain of someone who knew he'd been caught in serious wrongdoing. Mom moved closer to him, presenting a united front, but her expression was that of someone calculating how much damage control would be needed. "However," Melissa continued, "the trust established to manage this inheritance lists Jessica's parents and brother as beneficiaries with distribution authority, effectively giving them control over money that should have been exclusively Jessica's." She handed Tim a copy of the trust documents, and I watched his face as he read the beneficiary designations. His shock appeared genuine, and I began to wonder how much he'd known about the source of his wedding funding. "But the real issue isn't just the trust structure," Melissa said, pulling out bank statements and financial records. "It's how the trust funds have been used over the past 2 years." She began reading from a prepared summary, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace as nearby guests strained to hear the details of what was clearly a significant family financial scandal. In March 2023, $62,000 was withdrawn to pay off Timothy's graduate school loans. In July 2023, $45,000 was used as a down payment for Timothy and Catherine's townhouse. In November 2023, $15,000 paid for Mrs. Chen's kitchen renovation. And over the past 8 months, $38,000 has been spent on wedding-related expenses for tonight's celebration and tomorrow's ceremony. The numbers were devastating in their specificity and scope. Nearly $200,000 of my inheritance had been spent on expenses that benefited everyone in my family except me, while I'd been told that the money was being managed responsibly for my future. Tim was staring at the financial records with what appeared to be genuine horror. "Mom, Dad, is this true? Did you use Jessica's inheritance to pay for our wedding?" Before my parents could answer, Catherine interjected with characteristic defensiveness. "I don't understand what the problem is. This is family money being used for family celebrations. Jessica is benefiting from Tim's happiness just like everyone else." The statement was so breathtakingly self-centered that it left me momentarily speechless. In Catherine's worldview, being excluded from planning and attendance at a celebration funded by my money was somehow a benefit I should be grateful for. But Melissa was prepared for exactly this kind of deflection. "Ms. Walsh, the issue isn't whether family members should support each other. The issue is that Jessica was specifically excluded from decisions about how her inheritance was used while simultaneously being excluded from the benefits those expenditures provided." She pulled out another set of documents. These are email chains between Mrs. Chen and various wedding vendors. You'll notice that Jessica is explicitly excluded from all communications about expenses, scheduling, and planning. Mrs. Chen specifically requested that vendors not include Jessica in planning discussions or credit her for design work. The professional sabotage documentation was perhaps even more damaging than the financial theft because it revealed the deliberate nature of my exclusion. This wasn't accidental oversight or family preference. It was calculated manipulation designed to keep me ignorant of how my money was being spent while denying me any recognition for my contributions. Rachel stepped forward with her own folder of evidence. "I work in the event planning industry, and I've been documenting how Jessica's family has actively undermined her professional reputation while exploiting her skills." She pulled out screenshots of social media posts and vendor communications. Mrs. Chen has been telling wedding vendors and potential clients that Jessica's design business isn't reliable or professional, actively discouraging people from hiring her. At the same time, she's been using Jessica's work to promote other businesses, as in the case of the wedding stationery credit theft. The phrase credit theft hanging in the air drew surprised looks from several guests who were familiar with professional creative work. In Charlotte's social and business circles, intellectual property rights were well understood, and deliberately stealing credit for someone's creative work was considered both professionally and ethically unacceptable. Catherine's response to the credit theft accusation revealed how little she understood about professional ethics. "That's ridiculous. Jessica did the design as a family favor. She wasn't expecting professional credit for helping out her brother's wedding." "Actually," I said, finding my voice again, "I was expecting basic professional courtesy, which would include credit for my creative work. But more importantly, I was expecting to be treated like a family member, which would include being invited to the wedding I designed stationery for and helped fund." The contrast between my treatment and my contributions was becoming impossible to ignore. I had provided professional services at a substantial discount. My inheritance had funded the celebration, and yet I was standing outside the event explaining to strangers why I deserved basic respect and recognition. Tim finally spoke up, his voice shaky with what appeared to be genuine distress. "Jessica, I had no idea the wedding was being paid for with your inheritance. Mom and Dad told me they had been saving for years and wanted to give us the wedding of our dreams." His reaction suggested that he might have been as manipulated as I had been, just in a different way. While I'd been told my inheritance was Being managed responsibly, he'd been told that wedding expenses were coming from our parents' savings. The lies had been tailored to each of us to prevent us from comparing notes or questioning the financial arrangements. But my father's response revealed that the deception had been entirely deliberate. Instead of apologizing or showing remorse, he became defensive and attacking. "Jessica, you're embarrassing this entire family with this ridiculous spectacle. Your grandmother's money has been used for family purposes exactly as she would have wanted. The fact that you're making a scene at your brother's rehearsal dinner shows exactly the kind of selfishness and immaturity that made us hesitant to give you direct access to substantial funds." The victim blaming was classic manipulation, designed to make me question my own justified anger and focus on my supposed character flaws rather than their documented financial crimes. But after weeks of preparation and with evidence in hand, I was ready for exactly this kind of response. "Dad, you're right that Popo would have wanted her money used for family purposes. That's exactly why she left it specifically to me with instructions that it be used to provide me with independence and security. Using it to fund other people's expenses while excluding me from family celebrations is the opposite of what she intended." I pulled out my grandmother's letter, which Melissa had recovered from the estate records. Popo wrote about her hopes that this inheritance would allow me to pursue my dreams without financial stress. She specifically mentioned wanting me to have the independence to build my creative career without worrying about basic security. Reading my grandmother's words aloud, expressing her love for me and her hopes for my future, was emotionally overwhelming. But it also provided context for how profound the betrayal had been. My family hadn't just stolen money from me. They'd stolen my grandmother's final gift and perverted her intentions to benefit everyone except the person she'd chosen to receive her life savings. The presentation of evidence had achieved exactly what Melissa and I had hoped. It made denial impossible and forced my family to confront the reality of their actions in front of witnesses who could verify what had been said. The financial documentation was overwhelming. The professional sabotage was well documented, and the contrast between my treatment and my contributions was undeniable. But the most important part of the confrontation was still to come. Now that the facts were established, my family had to decide how they were going to respond. Would they acknowledge what they'd done and commit to making amends? Or would they continue to deny and deflect, forcing me to pursue more drastic measures? The silence on the terrace was profound as guests processed what they'd witnessed. These weren't vague family grievances or personality conflicts. These were specific, documented instances of financial fraud and professional sabotage that painted a clear picture of systematic exploitation. Catherine's mother, Patricia Walsh, was the first to break the silence. Her voice was tight with the kind of controlled anger that came from realizing her family's reputation was being damaged by association with financial misconduct. "Sandra, is what this young woman is saying true? Have you been using her inheritance to pay for wedding expenses without her knowledge or consent?" The question forced my mother to choose between admitting wrongdoing or lying to someone whose opinion mattered to her social standing. I could see her calculating which response would be less damaging to her reputation in Charlotte's social circles. "Patricia, this is a complicated family financial matter that Jessica doesn't fully understand. David and I have been managing her inheritance responsibly, and some of those funds have been used for important family events that benefit everyone." The response was carefully crafted to minimize wrongdoing while avoiding outright lies that could be contradicted by the evidence. But it also revealed that Mom was more concerned about managing her public image than addressing the harm she'd caused me. Melissa seized on the admission. "Mrs. Chen, you just acknowledged that you've been using Jessica's inheritance for family events without her knowledge or consent. That's the definition of financial misappropriation. The complexity of family relationships doesn't change the legal reality of what you've done." The legal terminology made the seriousness of the situation impossible to ignore. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through emotional appeals or private conversations. This was a legal matter with potential criminal implications. Tim's reaction was the most emotionally significant for me. He looked genuinely horrified as the full scope of what had happened became clear. When he spoke, his voice was shaky with what appeared to be authentic remorse. "Jessica, I'm so sorry. I had no idea any of this was happening. Mom and Dad told me they had been saving for the wedding, and I never questioned where the money was coming from. If I had known it was your inheritance, I never would have accepted it." His apology felt genuine, and I found myself hoping that he might actually be an ally rather than a collaborator in the deception. But Catherine's response immediately revealed that she had no intention of acknowledging wrongdoing or making amends. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "Jessica is ruining our rehearsal dinner because she's jealous that Tim is getting married and having the kind of life she can't achieve on her own. This whole thing is just attention-seeking behavior from someone who can't stand that her brother is successful and happy." The psychological manipulation in Catherine's response was breathtaking. She was attempting to reframe documented financial fraud as sibling jealousy and systematic exploitation as attention-seeking behavior. It was gaslighting on a grand scale, designed to make witnesses question the evidence they'd just seen presented. But her strategy backfired because it revealed the callousness that had allowed the exploitation to continue for so long. Here was someone confronted with evidence that her wedding had been funded through theft from her future sister-in-law, and her response was to attack the victim rather than express any concern about the wrongdoing. Several guests began to look uncomfortable as Catherine's response revealed character traits that didn't align with the generous, loving persona she'd been presenting. The contrast between her public image and her actual values was becoming impossible to ignore. My father tried to regain control of the situation by asserting paternal authority. "Jessica, you've made your point, and you've thoroughly embarrassed this family in front of our friends and Catherine's family. I think it's time for you to leave so that we can salvage what's left of this celebration." The attempt to dismiss me was predictable, but it also provided the perfect opening for the ultimatum Melissa and I had prepared. "Actually, Dad, I'm not leaving. This is my venue, paid for with my money, and I have every right to be here. But I am prepared to offer you and the family a choice about how we resolve this situation." I nodded to Melissa, who pulled out the final set of documents we'd prepared, a comprehensive restitution agreement that would allow my family to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for full financial restitution and public acknowledgement of their actions. "You can sign this agreement, which commits you to repaying the full amount of Jessica's inheritance that's been misappropriated, plus interest and legal fees. You'll also agree to public acknowledgement of the financial mismanagement and professional sabotage, and to correcting the false narratives you've spread about Jessica's professional reputation." Melissa's tone was businesslike and non-negotiable. "If you sign this agreement tonight, we can handle this matter privately and avoid criminal prosecution for trust fund fraud and professional sabotage. If you refuse, we'll be filing formal charges on Monday morning, and this matter will become a matter of public record." The ultimatum was clear and time-sensitive. My family could choose to take responsibility and make amends, or they could face the consequences of their actions. Through the legal system, the choice would reveal whether there was any possibility of salvaging our family relationships, or whether I needed to accept that the people who were supposed to love and support me were actually irredeemable exploiters who would never acknowledge wrongdoing or change their behavior. Looking around the terrace at the shocked faces of family and friends, at the beautiful venue that should have been a celebration but had become a crime scene, at the brother I'd hoped to reconnect with, and the parents who had systematically betrayed me, I waited to learn which version of my family I was really dealing with. The next few minutes would determine whether I was about to begin the process of rebuilding damaged relationships, or whether I was about to walk away from my family forever, financially compensated but emotionally orphaned. Either way, I was finally going to get the truth about where I stood with the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The silence that followed Melissa's ultimatum stretched across the terrace like a heavy blanket, broken only by the gentle sound of water from the fountain and the distant murmur of confused conversations among guests who were trying to process what they'd witnessed. The beautiful string lights that had been meant to create a romantic ambiance for Tim's rehearsal dinner now seemed to illuminate a crime scene where years of family dysfunction had finally been exposed. I watched my parents' faces as they absorbed the reality of their situation. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in our relationship. They could no longer dismiss my concerns, gaslight me about my perceptions, or control the narrative about our family dynamics. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were present, and the consequences were real. My father's face cycled through emotions I'd rarely seen from him: shock, anger, calculation, and finally something that might have been fear. He was a man who had built his identity around being the responsible patriarch who made sound decisions for his family. Now, he was confronted with undeniable proof that he had systematically stolen from his daughter while undermining her professional success. My mother's reaction was more complex. I could see her mind working, trying to find a way to minimize the damage to her reputation and social standing. She kept glancing at Catherine's mother and the other guests, clearly calculating how this revelation would affect her position in Charlotte's social circles. The woman who had raised me to value family loyalty above all else was now more concerned about public embarrassment than the harm she'd caused me. Tim looked genuinely devastated, and for a moment I felt sorry for him. He was collateral damage in a scheme he might not have fully understood, celebrating what he thought was his parents' generous gift when it was actually stolen money from his sister. But my sympathy was tempered by the recognition that he had participated in my exclusion, even if he hadn't understood the financial dimensions. Catherine's reaction was the most telling of all. Instead of showing any remorse or concern about the revelation that her wedding had been funded through theft, she looked primarily annoyed that her celebration was being disrupted. Her priorities were clear. Her comfort and social status mattered, more than justice or family relationships. The first person to break the silence was Catherine's father, Richard Walsh, who had been quietly observing the confrontation from near the bar. His voice was carefully controlled, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to handling serious business matters. "Sandra, David, I think you need to seriously consider this young lady's offer. What she's describing sounds like actionable fraud, and if even half of these allegations are accurate, you're facing significant legal exposure." His intervention changed the dynamic immediately. Richard Walsh carried considerable influence in Charlotte's business community, and his assessment of the legal situation gave weight to Melissa's ultimatum. If he believed the charges were serious, other prominent community members would take note. My father tried to maintain his dignity while responding to Richard's observation. "Richard, this is a complicated family matter that's been taken out of context. Jessica doesn't understand the complexities of estate management, and David, I've been managing estates and trusts for 30 years. Richard interrupted firmly. "What your attorney just described isn't complex estate management. It's misappropriation of funds. The complexity doesn't matter if you've been using someone else's inheritance without their knowledge or consent." The professional judgment from someone of Richard's stature seemed to deflate my father's attempts at justification. He couldn't dismiss Richard's expertise the way he'd been dismissing my concerns. Melissa seized the moment to reinforce the seriousness of the situation. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, I want to be very clear about your options here. We have documented evidence of systematic trust fund mismanagement totaling nearly $250,000. We have proof of professional sabotage that has damaged Jessica's business reputation and cost her potential income. We have witness testimony about deliberate exclusion from family events funded by her inheritance." She gestured toward the assembled guests. "All of this has now been presented in front of witnesses who can testify to both the evidence and your responses. If you choose not to accept our restitution offer, we will be filing criminal charges for financial fraud, and this matter will become public record." The legal pressure was intense, but I realized that what I really wanted was more than just financial restitution. I wanted acknowledgement of the emotional harm they'd caused, recognition of my worth as a family member, and genuine change in how they treated me going forward. "There's something else I need," I said, my voice stronger now than it had been at the beginning of the evening. "I don't just want the money back. I want a public acknowledgement of what you've done, an apology for years of excluding and undermining me, and a commitment to treating me as an equal member of this family going forward." The emotional demands were perhaps more challenging for my parents than the financial restitution. They could write a check to make the legal problems disappear, but acknowledging their emotional abuse would require admitting that their treatment of me had been deliberately harmful rather than justified by my supposed inadequacies. My mother spoke for the first time since the ultimatum had been presented, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Jessica, you're asking us to humiliate ourselves in front of our friends and Catherine's family. Can't we handle this privately, as a family?" The irony of her request was stunning. After years of publicly excluding me while privately exploiting my resources, she wanted privacy to avoid accountability for her actions. The same woman who had allowed Catherine to publicly dismiss me as too unreliable for professional work was now concerned about her own public embarrassment. "Mom, you've humiliated me publicly for years by excluding me from family events while telling people I was too busy or disinterested to participate. You've damaged my professional reputation by telling potential clients that my business wasn't reliable. You've stolen my inheritance to fund celebrations I wasn't allowed to attend. I think a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing is the least you can provide." Tim finally found his voice again, and when he spoke, his words surprised me. "Mom, Dad, Jessica is right. What you've done is wrong, and I don't want any part of it. If my wedding has been funded by stealing from my sister, then I don't want that money." His statement created a new dynamic in the confrontation. If Tim rejected the stolen funds, my parents would be forced to find alternative financing for a wedding that was supposed to happen the next day. The practical implications of their choices were becoming immediate and concrete. Catherine's reaction to Tim's moral stance revealed the depth of her self-centeredness. "Tim, you can't be serious. The wedding is tomorrow. All of our guests are here. You can't cancel everything because Jessica is having a tantrum about family finances." The dismissal of documented financial fraud as a tantrum was so breathtakingly callous that several guests audibly gasped. Here was a woman whose wedding had been funded through theft from her future sister-in-law, and her primary concern was avoiding inconvenience to her celebration. But Tim's response showed that he had more integrity than I'd given him credit for. "Catherine, this isn't a tantrum. Jessica has proof that our wedding has been paid for with money stolen from her inheritance. How can you expect me to celebrate when I know our happiness has come at the cost of cheating my sister?" The conflict between Tim and Catherine added another layer of drama to an already explosive situation. Their disagreement about how to respond to the revelation suggested that their relationship might not survive the moral test that my confrontation had created. Rachel, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, stepped forward with practical information that changed the conversation once again. "Actually, if the issue is wedding logistics, I might be able to help with that. Through my industry contacts, I know that several venues have last-minute availability, and most vendors would be willing to transfer their services for a modest fee adjustment." Her offer created a potential solution that would allow Tim to reject the stolen funds without completely canceling his wedding. It also demonstrated the kind of family support I'd been hoping for, but had never received from my own relatives. But Catherine's response to Rachel's generous offer revealed her true priorities. "I'm not having my wedding at some second-rate venue because Jessica decided to make a scene. We've planned this celebration for over a year, and I'm not changing anything because of family drama. The word drama, applied to documented financial fraud, was the final straw for several guests who had been listening with growing discomfort. I could see people beginning to distance themselves from Catherine, both physically and socially, as her selfishness became impossible to ignore. My father made one last attempt to control the situation by appealing to family loyalty. "Jessica, whatever problems we've had as a family, surely we can work them out without involving lawyers and making threats. We're family, and family should be able to forgive and move forward together." The appeal to family loyalty from someone who had been systematically betraying me for years was almost laughable. But it also provided me with the opportunity to articulate what real family loyalty should look like. "Dad, you're right that families should be able to forgive and move forward together. But that requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine remorse, and commitment to change. What you've been calling family loyalty has actually been exploitation disguised as normal family dynamics." I gestured toward the beautiful venue around us. Real family loyalty would have meant including me in planning celebrations funded by my inheritance. It would have meant crediting my professional work and supporting my business success. It would have meant treating me as an equal family member whose opinions and feelings mattered. The contrast between their treatment of me and genuine family support was becoming clear to everyone present. My requests weren't unreasonable or vindictive. They were basic expectations for how family members should treat each other. Melissa checked her watch and provided a practical deadline to the emotional conversation. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I need a decision within the next 10 minutes. The restitution agreement has specific terms and deadlines, and if you choose to reject it, we'll need to begin legal proceedings immediately." The time pressure forced my parents to make a choice without the luxury of extended deliberation or consultation. They had to decide in front of witnesses whether they were willing to take responsibility for their actions or face the consequences through the legal system. My mother looked around the terrace at the assembled guests, many of whom were prominent members of Charlotte's social community. I could see her calculating the reputational damage of each option, admitting wrongdoing publicly versus facing criminal charges for financial fraud. When she finally spoke, her voice was resigned but still tinged with resentment. "Fine. We'll sign your agreement. But I want it noted that we've always acted in what we believe to be the family's best interests." The qualified acceptance was typical of my mother's inability to take full responsibility even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. She was agreeing to restitution while still maintaining that her intentions had been good. But Melissa was prepared for exactly this kind of conditional acceptance. "Mrs. Chen, the agreement requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to specific behavioral changes. General statements about good intentions aren't sufficient." The legal precision forced my mother to be more specific about what she was admitting. After several minutes of negotiation, we settled on language that acknowledged the misappropriation of my inheritance, the professional sabotage of my business, and the deliberate exclusion from family events. My father's signature on the restitution agreement was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. For 29 years, he had wielded financial and emotional authority over me, making me feel dependent and inadequate. Now he was legally committing to return money he had stolen and to treat me with the respect I deserved. But the real victory came when Tim approached me after the formal documents were signed. "Jessica, I want you to know that Catherine and I are postponing the wedding. I can't celebrate when I know it's been built on hurting you. We need to figure out how to do this right, in a way that includes you and honors what family should actually mean." His decision to postpone the wedding was more meaningful than the financial restitution because it represented a choice to prioritize family relationships over convenience and social expectations. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a brother who actually cared about my welfare. Catherine's reaction to Tim's decision was predictably selfish, but it also revealed the kind of person she truly was underneath her polished exterior. Tim, You're making a huge mistake. You're throwing away our perfect wedding because your sister can't handle not being the center of attention." But Tim's response showed that the evening's revelations had fundamentally changed his perspective on both family loyalty and Catherine's character. "Catherine, if you can't understand why I need to do right by my sister after learning that she's been stolen from and excluded to fund our celebration, then maybe we need to reconsider whether we're right for each other." The confrontation between Tim and Catherine played out in front of the assembled guests, providing a real-time demonstration of how moral tests reveal people's true character. The beautiful rehearsal dinner that was supposed to celebrate their love had instead become a crucible that exposed fundamental differences in their values. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many approached me with apologies for not recognizing my exclusion and expressions of support for demanding accountability. The public nature of the confrontation had created allies I never expected and revealed community support I hadn't known existed. Richard Walsh, Catherine's father, made a point of speaking with me before leaving. "Jessica, I want you to know that what happened here tonight took tremendous courage. Standing up to family exploitation is never easy, but you handled this with dignity and strength." His validation from someone of his stature in the community was both personally meaningful and professionally valuable. Word of my confrontation with my family would spread through Charlotte's business networks, but the story would emphasize my integrity and courage rather than family dysfunction. The most significant conversation of the evening came as I was preparing to leave. My mother approached me hesitantly, her earlier defensiveness replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "Jessica, I know I can't undo the harm we've caused, but I want you to know that I do love you. I've made terrible mistakes in how I've shown that love." Her acknowledgement was more than I'd expected and less than I'd hoped for. It wasn't a complete apology or a full taking of responsibility, but it was recognition that her behavior had been harmful rather than justified. "Mom, I love you too, but love has to be demonstrated through actions, not just words. The restitution agreement is a start, but rebuilding our relationship will require consistent change in how you treat me going forward." The conversation ended without dramatic reconciliation or permanent estrangement. Instead, we had established new terms for our relationship based on mutual respect and accountability rather than the old dynamic of exploitation and manipulation. 6 months later, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The financial restitution had allowed me to expand my design business, lease professional office space, and hire an assistant. My professional reputation, which had been damaged by years of family sabotage, was stronger than ever as word spread about my integrity and courage. Tim and Catherine had eventually married in a small ceremony funded by their own savings and family contributions that didn't involve stolen money. I was included in the planning and served as Tim's best woman, a role that honored our sibling relationship in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. My relationship with my parents remained complicated but was gradually improving. The restitution agreement had established clear boundaries about financial transparency and family inclusion, and they were making genuine efforts to treat me as an equal family member. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself enough to demand respect and accountability from the people who claimed to love me. The confrontation at Rosewood Gardens had been terrifying and painful, but it had also been liberating in ways that continued to shape how I approached all my relationships. The venue that had been the scene of my family's exploitation had become the symbol of my empowerment. Every time I drove past Rosewood Gardens, I remembered not the years of betrayal that had led to that evening, but the moment when I finally found the courage to demand the treatment I deserved. The story of that night became part of Charlotte's social folklore, a cautionary tale about family financial abuse, and an inspiring example of someone finding the strength to stand up for themselves. But for me, it was simply the night I stopped being a victim and started being the author of my own life story. The money that was returned to me was significant, but the self-respect I gained was priceless. learning that I deserved better treatment, and having the courage to demand it changed everything about how I moved through the world. Family relationships are supposed to provide love, support, and security. When they become sources of exploitation and abuse instead, having the courage to demand change or walk away isn't selfish or ungrateful. It's necessary for survival and growth. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who claim to love us most. But real love is demonstrated through actions that show respect, support, and genuine care for our welfare. Anything less isn't love at all, no matter what it's called or how it's justified. The night I confronted my family at their stolen celebration was the night I finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. That knowledge changed everything, and for that, I will always be grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.